Hi there. I think I'm going to call this the manual mode myth because I like alliteration. But the fact is that there are a large number of, in many cases, quite talented amateur photographers who seem to believe that the only way to be a serious photographer is if you shoot entirely in manual mode. Okay, let's take a look at that for a moment. Manual mode was the only possibility in the past. And now I'm talking about a fairly distant past here, before auto exposure systems were created at all. We had manual. We had to set the aperture. We had to set the shutter speed. We had to focus. And since it was pre-digital, we set our ISO, or ASA as it was then, to the appropriate film speed we were using so that our meter would tell us what the correct exposure would be. And of course that meter was often a separate handheld meter or dead reckoning. We just guessed. All right. That is a situation where there was no choice. I started my photography with cameras that did have a through-the-lens meter. However, they were totally manual. All I could do with the meter was center a needle. It would give me a center-weighted average of the scene, and I would then have to guesstimate how much I needed to over or underexpose in order to get the effect I wanted. A little tricky, but it was something I had to do. I had to learn it. Nowadays, I don't have to do all that. I have my favorite mode, aperture priority, because it controls my depth of field. And I have a neat little control called an exposure compensation. If I use the two of those, I can get the exposure where I want it. I can accentuate the darks, I can accentuate the brights, I can make sure that there are no burned out highlights. I can do all those things. And I can do it much more quickly than the person next to me who's fumbling with his ISO and his aperture and his shutter speed because he must shoot in manual. Now, what's really ironic about this is that a lot of the people who feel that way are actually doing nothing more than setting their camera to what the camera's automatic system would have set it on anyway. I use aperture priority, as I said. Why aperture priority? Because I think control over depth of field has more visual impact than any other control. Now, do I use manual mode? Of course. If I'm in a situation where variations in lighting can throw the meter off, I will make sure that I meter properly for the scene and then leave it there. Okay, and as long as the main light, the light that I'm really shooting with, does not change, changes in the background and things won't matter. Manual mode, if I'm doing a stage show, is almost vital, for the simple reason that the backgrounds and lighting effects and so on, even though they may not be on the actors or dancers that I am shooting, they will throw the meter all over the place. So at one point I'll get silhouettes of dancers, at another point they'll be burnt out little blobs in my image. So by basically spot metering on them and leaving the metering there, as long as their light does not vary, now the backgrounds can get bright, dark, doesn't matter. My subject is correct. That's a perfect place to use manual. In a case where you need to shoot quickly, like street photography, sometimes you can set it on manual, set an exposure that's going to work most of the time, and then your camera basically becomes very much a point and shoot. But again, that's a very specific thing. Meanwhile, there are cases for the other modes as well, of course. I mean, shutter priority, if you need control over the shutter speed, if that is the aspect of exposure that's going to have the greatest visual impact in your image, then of course you need to control it. Now, some will stop me now and say, but if I'm shooting manual, I'm already controlling all of these things. Yes, that's true. And nobody said that shooting manual was a bad thing. The only thing is, please, don't use manual shooting as some sort of badge of honor. Okay? All too often, I've had people basically kind of sniff and walk away when they found out that I wasn't shooting manual, because somehow I wasn't worthy anymore because, well, I wasn't a manual shooter, so I wasn't a real photographer. If this sounds like I'm maybe a little irritated by this, please don't read too much into it. I just find that in almost any aspect of any job or career or hobby, you will find people who, because they have learned a particular skill, and because they have heard this particular skill expounded by others as being such a great thing, they tend to generalize that so that people who do not practice this particular skill are somehow inferior. Get over that, guys. Some of the greatest photographers out there right now rarely ever shoot in manual. Some others never take their camera off manual. Either way works. So, why do I call it the manual mode myth? Because the manual mode is not an absolute necessity in order to make serious, well-exposed images. It is just one way of getting to the same result. Different people have different preferred methods. A bird photographer might prefer shutter priority because they need to capture that speed. A sports photographer may choose shutter priority because they need to stop the action. Meanwhile, a landscape photographer may shoot entirely in manual because they want to make sure that minor little variations from cloud cover and so on are not going to throw off their image. If you are shooting a panorama, then of course you shoot in manual because you want each frame in that panorama to match the frame before, which means it has to be shot at exactly the same exposure. The only way to be reasonably sure of that, if the lighting is fairly even, is to set it on manual so that you know that every one of these exposures was the same. And then, of course, if your image goes from light to dark, it's going to do so fluidly. It's not going to be a case of images that have to be adjusted somehow to make them fit, which is very difficult and in some cases nigh impossible. So, where does that leave us? What's the takeaway from this? Please, don't become one of those people that somehow raises yourself above others because of the way in which you practice this art. Some great photographers are out there now who probably have never taken their camera off program. The thing is that they have a good eye. Their images don't depend entirely upon depth of field or freezing action. The result is that their images are very good. Some of you may have taken a simple point-and-shoot camera on vacation sometime and were amazed by how well the images looked afterwards. Because technology will try its best to give you the best result. Is it always going to succeed? Of course not. That's why there are overrides. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give me a like. If you want to see more of my videos, of course, subscribe to this channel. And if you think anybody else needs a little push towards being maybe a little more flexible in their photography, then by all means share this video. Well, bye for now.